Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen. This is Leonard for the Ultimate Growth Experience podcast. Today I have one of my heroes, academic and intellectual friend of mine, Dr. Paul Taillon. So he's a current University of Auckland senior lecturer. He specialises in American labour movement and working class politics. He's a specialist on the late 19th and early 20th century United States history and is an author of a book titled Good, Reliable White Men, Railroad Brotherhoods, 1877 to 1917, which was published in 2009. He was my lecturer for 3 papers in my university career: History 357, Making Modern America 1877 to 1924, History 241, Making Sense of the Sixties, and History 108, The Rise and Fall of the United States. He's been in the University of Auckland since 1999. Paul is a Discipline Convener and the husband of Associate Professor Jennifer Frost as well. Paul, welcome to the Ultimate Growth Experience podcast.
Kia ora, Leonard. Thank you for having me on.
Phenomenal. So Paul, like myself, you and your family immigrated to New Zealand. So what was it like adapting to new life here?
On the one hand, it wasn't that difficult to transition because on the one hand, New Zealand is English-speaking, as I am.
Anglo-Saxon.
Didn't have to learn a new language. It's a settler society, much like the United States, and the culture is not that different. All of those sorts of matters made transitioning not very difficult at all. On the other hand, probably the biggest thing that struck me in the early years after the gee whiz phase, there's always the gee whiz phase, wow, this is neat and cool and everything's new, actually during the gee whiz phase, it was how much smaller New Zealand is than the United States. The United States is massive, and that's a factor, a feature that you are aware of growing up and living in the United States, but that is normal. When you move and live in a much smaller country like New Zealand, which is smaller than the metropolitan area of the city or the area in which I grew up in, Chicago, it's really quite different. And so the distance, I mean, we have a very long country north-south, but it's a very narrow country east-west. And the degrees of separation. In my first years here, I was separated by 2 degrees from the head of state just because of the relationships Helen Clark had with academic staff at the University of Auckland, who I knew. And in fact, I've met our present Prime Minister some few years ago when I was co-president of the TEU at the University of Auckland at an event. She was MP from Auckland Central. We met at, she probably doesn't remember me, but we met at some event, and
I'll mention you when she comes on the show in the future.
Yes, and so those sorts of features were what struck me as being very different. In addition to many of the cultural differences, different ways of speaking, and so of course
Kiwi slang, obviously.
Yes, and the old traditional ones like "G'day, mate," and "How you going?" and "Good on you," those sorts of things. And more recently, with the help of my children, more up-to-date vernacular. And so, at the shops, I feel like I've assimilated when I'm asked if I want to restate it. It's like, nah, bro, it's all good. It's sweet.
I think that's the same thing because I use that sort of slangs.
Well, and in fact, one time when I was back in home visiting my family, I went out to the pub with my brother, and Chicagoans sound like they're geese. They have really broad nasal American accents. And so my brother's honking away, talking at me, and I'm talking back. And the barman, who's from Dublin, asked me where I'm from. And I say, I'm from here. He goes, no, you're not. And I go, yes, I am. And then I explained, oh, well, I've lived away for many years and so forth. And he goes, your accent's all fucked up, mate. So it softened a bit. But no, assimilating and fitting in was not that hard at all.
Not a problem at all.
Although in the early years, you immigrated with your family, I imagine. And in my case, Jennifer and I, we shifted, but we didn't do so at once because I got the job offer, and Jennifer had a job offer back, or she had a permanent job in Colorado.
Oh.
And so we did not intend at first that this would be permanent, because when I accepted the job and then I met with a few of the members of staff. I said, "Oh, by the way, I'm married to a historian, and she's not half bad." And straight away they said, "Nah, not a chance, mate," which is what I expected. There wouldn't be any real possibility for her.
Yeah.
And so we did this tag team sort of thing where she stayed in the U.S. for several months. I was here by myself. She got a leave of absence. She'd join me. But in those early years, it was quite lonely. I mean, I had friends in the department, but I didn't know many people outside of the university. So those early years were quite challenging in that regard. But now that Jennifer has gotten a full-time job, we've lived here for almost 20 years. We've got kids. They've integrated us into the community. Our lives are incredibly rich, both within the university through our colleagues and students and friends, as well as a range of associations, relationships outside of the university through our kids and our various sports activities.
Because I find it sort of amazing and cool to see couples working together like this. I will ask you a question later on about that, obviously. Speaking of history, I'm a fellow lover. I mean, I fell in love with the subject since I took your History 108 course, and I've been a follower of Bernie Sanders' political journey and other things, which led me to the rabbit hole. So you've really inspired me to read more books about politics and history, and particularly economic history as well. So what made you so passionate about American history?
In the first instance, it's the history of the country that I've grown up in, and I felt it was a history and that I needed to know, and in some sense be responsible for too. It's also a great history. It's a great history in the sense that it's a compelling history. And I'll just be upfront about it. I don't find any other national history as compelling as United States history, and I don't mean that as a diss on any other history.
I agree.
But for me, it's just the most compelling because it's my own history. But also because, and I don't mean to slip into a quasi-American exceptionalist stance here, but the ideals and values which at its best the United States is meant to stand for on the one hand, and indeed the story of its creation in a war for independence and separation from an empire, with stated principles in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and indeed it was a revolutionary experience, are really noble values, taken at their best. But the story of the United States is one of those values not met and indeed compromised. And so it's the distance, the gap, the contradiction between the principles for which that nation is meant to stand and the reality of inequality and oppression, racism, sexism, nativism, and injustice that I've found compelling. And I've always felt that as historians, we need to, as Frederick Douglass said, speak truth to power, and we need to be fully aware of the best and the worst features of our national histories. And we need our communities to be aware of those facts, and ultimately to be the best citizens that we can be. And so, personally, but also in my teaching, learning history is about citizenship, responsible, engaged citizenship. It's not that learning history is a guide to the future. It's not that it's a crystal ball, but learning history expands your knowledge of the past and the present, and it equips you to act into the future. In other words, I believe that the study of history can make you a wiser person. It helps you to make good choices. I can't tell you what the right choice is, but I think it prepares you to make good choices.
So it prepares you for the future, essentially, because you can see the human decisions that, for example, Napoleon or even Franklin Roosevelt or even these political or even small figures have done that led to some sorts of consequences. So you're telling us to learn lessons. That's what the main thing of history is about, right?
Correct. And that's stating, as you stated it, in a nutshell. But if you broaden that out to the range of human experience in the past, think of it as taking on the experience of that vast human past. It's more than you can get your mind around, but it provides lessons, as you said, on the one hand, but it also, I think, should and can increase one's capacity for empathy. And I think that's a quality we desperately need in the world today.
Yes, it's well, when you look at since the 1980s and the growth of so-called, I call supply side economics, and not denying the fact that there's a lot of value in individuality and individual sovereignty and responsibility, but when that goes too far and corrupts within itself, which is what we've seen in the global financial crisis. Now, everybody knows in this podcast that I'm a heavily intellectual sort of person, so you'll see my viewpoints as well, but you mentioned that quite well, indeed, I think.
Yes. The values that you mentioned, Leonard, in terms of individual responsibility and so forth, I think are very important. And this marks perhaps the classic point of division between conservatives and liberals or progressives or whatever you want to call them. The capacity or the balance on the scales we put in terms of compassion and empathy and taking responsibility for one's fellow citizen on the one hand, in terms of their conditions of life on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think the legitimate view that individuals need to take responsibility for their own lives.
Yes,
I believe in both.
Which is the podcast is all about the self aspect, but also understanding the other side simultaneously.
Correct, and at the same time, and it's interesting, you can take both progressive and conservative takes on history. I also find a great deal of value in the stories of individual people and their successes, both national leaders like Roosevelt you mentioned, and the difference that individuals can make in positions of leadership or individual genius in terms of either artistic creation or inventions or whatnot, at the very same time that those individuals that we might not hear about are tremendously important too.
Yes.
And so one book that is, I think, that really goes to that is by I'm blanking his name. I've Got the Light of Freedom is the name of it. It's the story of civil rights organizers in Mississippi, many of whom you've not heard about, but who individually were incredibly courageous people, organizing in the face of tremendous injustice and great personal risk to their lives for racial justice. Those individual stories, together with the stories of great leaders, are super important. Alongside
John Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr.
Correct.
Right. So, you are the second author to come along to my show with, I know you won't like him, but Dr. Don Brash.
I busted a gut when I saw that Mr. Brash, Dr. Brash had preceded me. That's awesome.
So what advice would you give to aspiring journalists and authors? So if I tell you my story, Paul, I would like to write a thesis when I'm older. And we've had discussion before about my personal sort of ambition in terms of the academic world. So what are your thoughts?
Read and write.
Read and write.
Read and write. Read and write, repeat as necessary. Yes. You can't read too much, and you can't read too much of a wide range of materials from books of different intellectual and political perspectives to the newspaper, which is an archaic term, but the current news media, to classics of literature. It's analogous to learning history that expands your realm of experience and knowledge, and depending on what kind of writing you want to do, whether it's fiction or news reporting or creative nonfiction, it's expanding that realm of experience that gives you stuff to draw upon on the one hand. And on the other hand, writing is like being a sportsman. You need to do it. You need to train. You need to stay fit. And if you don't write, your writing muscles and agility atrophy. So you need to write a lot. You need to write regularly, whether it's small things or big things, keeping a journal, taking notes, writing small op-eds, whatever it may be. Writing regularly is tremendously important.
So it's repetition, like sort of working out.
Training.
And it's actually the same thing.
Correct. Going to the gym, training, staying fit, getting ready for the big competition. I make a lot of sports analogies. If you've been my student, you'll be familiar with this.
Michael Chapman's a big fan of my podcast.
Okay, Michael, this one's for you. Yep. You know what we're doing here, depending on your sport, it's either batting practice every day or it's practicing your ball skills for football. That is European football, soccer.
soccer or football. Same
Yes.
thing.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Indeed. So, Paul, did you have any intellectual figures or heroes that you had influencing you as a young man that made you sort of go and guide you in this direction of the academic world? Like, did you have any different dreams that you would have maybe taken? So, for example, if I give you one of my sort of favorite authors, I know he's a conservative, but Thomas Sowell wanted to be a batsman for the Brooklyn Dodgers. But was there any story like that, or like any intellectuals that you really, really found fonding?
Well, that raises two interesting lines of discussion. I'll just touch on the first before returning to your question. I think many academics are wannabe performers, whether it's in sports, music, or drama, and they either didn't have the talent to do that, or they found academia and the life of the mind more compelling. But there's something about teaching, and I think also writing as for publishing, that is an aspect of performance, and that you enjoy, or you're not totally uncomfortable being the center of attention, on the one hand. On the other hand, in terms of intellectual figures, perhaps like many students, and whether or not they've gone on to academia, professors, lecturers that I've had probably have been most influential. In my case, the historian that supervised my senior thesis or honors dissertation, it's called a senior thesis in the United States, and who has been very influential in the kind of history that I do, would be David Roediger. David Roediger is a historian of the United States. He's from downstate Illinois. I'm from the Chicago area, so I'm from upstate Illinois. I would describe him as a historian of the American working class and racism, or white racial identity. He was one of the earliest or first historians to talk about and to write about whiteness and whiteness as a racial identity. And he, in his scholarship, has written about the power and privilege that comes with whiteness, and how it has acted to cut against class solidarity and class consciousness, and in fact how the kind of class consciousness and class formation we've seen in the United States over the 19th and 20th centuries has been formed as much by white racial identity and racial hierarchy as class structure and class identity as well. So in the 1980s and 1990s, when I was transitioning from my undergraduate to graduate study, David was writing this work, and I happened almost simultaneously to become interested in it, and that was a theme in my PhD dissertation and my book. And so intellectually David was quite important, but also as a teacher he was, because, as I said, he supervised my senior thesis, but he was also a lecturer for one of my upper level history courses. And he was a model of unpretentious, straightforward, honest teaching. He if you know David, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but he speaks with a downstate kind of twang, and not a Chicago nasal accent, and his empathy and caring for his subjects comes through his teaching and his writing. And I remember when he showed a documentary on the Flint sit-down strike of 1937, which was when the auto workers occupied the Ford assembly plant, not Ford, it was GM assembly plant, and the police were going to were going to come in and forcibly remove them, and the wives of the union members formed the Ladies' Brigade, and they kept them fed, brought them food, formed a barrier between the police and so it was all about the women activism and how they made this industrial action succeed. And at the end of screening this documentary, he was there just dabbing his eyes. It brought tears to his eyes at the end of and I'd never seen a lecturer have tears in his eyes.
Shows passion.
After teaching as such, I thought, wow. And so just his example of scholarship and his kind of teaching, he was very important for me.
And the sporting, anything that you wanted to do? You never had any sporting
Oh
ambition?
The
second part of the question.
Yes, I did, and I do. Ice hockey in my case.
You mentioned it a number of times when you were my lecturer.
Yes, I grew up playing ice hockey, and I still play it, and I referee ice hockey. I'm quite involved in the Auckland ice hockey community, and I'm a goaltender, and that's, I think, interesting because, and this will come out of left field, I'm a goaltender in perhaps the same sort of way that Steve Carroll, the actor and comedian, was a goaltender when he was young. Because his brother put it this way, he always wanted to be the center of attention. And ice hockey goaltenders, like soccer goaltenders, and like pitchers in baseball and perhaps batsmen in cricket, although that might be stretching it, are the key players of their team. If they don't play well, the team doesn't do well. So there's a lot of pressure on the goaltender, and the goaltender is at the center of attention when they make a great save, but then if they let in a goal, then they're the GOAT. So it's one of those kinds of positions. But it's a kind of position in terms of the attention that you draw to yourself that's, I think, carries over into teaching and performing before a class. Anyhow, no, there was never any chance of me going over with ice hockey, but I love the sport and I still play it, and it's the other half of my life.
That's sort of like my connection to golf. So as a graduate, you were a graduate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So you went to the American education system. So how different is the New Zealand system? Well, we talked about it briefly before we began the podcast, obviously.
Well, anything I say is going to be very dated, of course, because I was in high school in the late 1970s, university in the first half of the 1980s, and graduate school in the second half of the 1980s and first part of the 1990s. So that's a few years ago. But the main things I would say that are different, some of them are not that important. In New Zealand, students start kindergarten or year one a year earlier than kids do in the United States. And so the years that you go through, or the grades in the United States, they don't quite align quite in the same way. In the United States, intermediate is actually 3 years, or maybe 2 years someplace, but that's not quite consistent with our 2 years here. And you don't have, you might have combined junior high schools in some places, but usually it's separate. So all those sorts of things are different. The main difference, I would say, has to do with the number of years and nature of the undergraduate degree. In New Zealand, our undergraduate degree is a 3-year degree. In the United States, it's a 4-year degree. And I think the U.S. degree is a stronger, better degree for that 4th year. Students undertake a broader range of study. At most universities, at least the one that I went to, you are required to take a broader range of subjects, electives, if you will, in addition to your major and your minor. You have to demonstrate competency in a second language. I think it's a shame, really. It's not very. We should be requiring a second language of our students at university in New Zealand, but with a 3-year degree, there really isn't any room. And what's more, and I'm a case in point here, the 4-year degree allows you a little bit more time to find what you're doing.
Yes.
I went through at least 3 major changes before I ended up doing history, because I realized, wait a minute, I'm enjoying that and I'm doing well. So I went through English at least, and then journalism and communication studies. It's like, no, I didn't like any of those. And history is what I ended up settling on at the last moment because I loved it. And so in New Zealand, with a 3-year degree, you've got to get that sorted very quickly. In fact, the way that high school seems to work here, already by year 12 and 13, students are narrowing themselves. And I think that's unfortunate. I'm just an old school, unapologetic believer in a broad liberal arts education, whether you are going to become a doctor, a lawyer, or accountant, or what have you. And that brings me to another difference. Law and medicine are postgraduate degrees in the United States, whereas they're undergraduate degrees here.
Yes.
I think they're better as postgraduate degrees. First, having that broad training. Many of my friends were pre-meds, as they were called, taking chemistry, but some were history majors too, taking the range of requirements to qualify them for entrance into medical school. It takes longer, yes, it's true, but I think ultimately you come out a broader, well-rounded person and probably a better doctor. And I say that not just because of the technical skills you learn, but because of the range of information, the range of learning that you take in. Again, think back to why I think history is important. This applies to many of the humanities disciplines. Expanding your realm of experience. It simply makes you a better person.
A better person indeed, more experience. I like that. So between you and Jennifer, I noticed that you both have great chemistry as fellow, lecturers and a couple. So what's it like to have a partner in crime as a colleague at the University of Auckland?
On the one hand, we're fairly unique. We're not totally unique because we have a number of friends, married partners, who are also academics, whether both historians or historians in another academic discipline. And so we're not totally unusual, but compared to most people in the regular run of the world, we're very unique. When I tell people, oh yeah, Jennifer's office is right next to mine, we work in the same, I think that's really strange. But I can't think of it any other way, because we share so much in terms of our lives together. Intellectually, we share an office, a study at home, which sometimes can get a bit challenging, to be sure. Jennifer likes to talk aloud while she works. Sorry, honey. She'll be commenting to herself. I tend not to. And I'm like, what? On the one hand. But we, on the other hand, when it comes to our scholarship or teaching or or service work, we're talking and conversing with each other, whether it's at home and the drive in or whatnot. So we are very efficient, and we give good value to the university, I think, because of that. Some institutions, maybe this has changed, but in the past have been leery of married academic couples for fear, as I've had it put to me, either you'll form a power block on the one hand, or on the other hand, and this is legitimate. If the marriage breaks up, then that can lead to some awkwardness at the very least within the academic unit. So that's fair. But on the other hand, there are, our work is always with us. So that can be a liability, although to be sure,
not really.
As an academic, my work is always with me. We don't punch 9 to 5 time clocks. We work at home. We work at the office. Our teaching and academic lives are thoroughly mixed in with the rest of our lives, evenings and weekends. So that seems to be perfectly normal. Maybe in other sectors that's more typical these days. So, but the fact that we don't leave work at the office, and so for many married couples, maybe that would sound like a burden, and at times, maybe that can be a challenge, I'd say. But I can't imagine any other way.
I don't really think it'll be a problem because you both love the subject so much.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Plus, you know me quite personally, right? Is that I always talk about intellectual topics in front of my friends, and they tell me, Leah, you're crazy. Do you ever talk about anything else? Like, I don't know, video games? And I'm like, no, I love this.
Well, and to be sure, we do talk about many other things. Our kids form a big subject. Politics in the world, of course.
Yes.
And just, family, random stuff. So we're pretty normal that way.
Exactly. And speaking of that, because, your history courses, like, I'm not kidding you. A lot of my friends who are listening to this will acknowledge this. All of your history courses are one of the most popular courses taken in the history department. I'm not kidding you. I tried to enroll myself to the Sixties courses in 2016, and it nearly didn't get in because that's how bloody it was filling up so quickly.
Well, it's nice to have well-enrolled courses, but I get pretty self-conscious when it comes to talking about popularity. We just, and I can speak for Jennifer, we want our students to enjoy the classes they teach. We want them to take as much away as possible. And Jennifer, I think, puts it well. During the course of a semester, we have our students for, 11, but you add up the lectures and the tutorial hours, and this is why it's important to come to lectures and tutorials, everybody. We have you for this time. That is precious these days, and we need to make the most of it. And indeed, for every university student, your time at university is so brief. You need to make the most of it, and we want you to make the most of it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I sound like I'm preaching here, but this is why we do what we do.
Yes.
There's no point in doing it otherwise. I mean, we get paid well, to be sure, but we don't. It's not to say we don't do it for the money, but we don't do it for the love. We do it because we think this is important.
Because you care about the students.
Yes, and the subjects, and our students are, again, I'm sounding like a cliche, but you're our future. That's why I'm so concerned about academic engagement and civic responsibility. It's about doing good in your communities and in the world.
Totally that. So, the hard question. So, if you had to suggest 3 books to students, what would they be?
This is okay, everybody. So Leonard gave me some questions ahead of time, and all good. But this one, I immediately drew a blank. I mean, so many books to choose from. How many books have I read? I mean, I'm thinking of fiction, I'm thinking of history, and
non-fiction.
Anyway, but I sort of thought, no, this is about history, and then I thought in terms of 3 different books, not all relating to U.S. history, but history. So, one book I would recommend is by John Lewis Gaddis called The Landscape of History. Gaddis is a U.S. historian of foreign relations, specializes in the Cold War. But this book, The Landscape of History, is a collection of essays in which he talks about why history is important, how do historians know what they know, is there any historical truth? So if you want a really good collection of essays in terms of what is history and how do historians think, this is the book to read, and this would be the first book to read. In fact, the first essay in this book I have used, as have my colleagues Joe Zizik and Jonathan Scott, who teach History 300. We assign this piece because it's that important. It's one of the sort of touchstone pieces or point of departure pieces in the class.
Mm-hmm.
A second book I would recommend, moving to the subject of U.S. history, is Eric Foner's The Story of American Freedom. There are so many books about United States history, but I like this book in the first instance because Eric Foner, who I might identify as another tremendously important U.S. historian and something of an intellectual inspiration to me as well. In this book, he gives a survey, an interpretation, not a survey, of American history, focusing on the theme of American freedom. American freedom as something perhaps distinctive, but most importantly, American freedom as a central something that Americans have fought, engaged with over time. It's a way to understand the history of the United States in a fairly slim book. So it's something of an intellectual and cultural, social history. And then thirdly, as a different kind of study, something more of a micro history, a case study, an example of an incredibly well-written, compelling, page-turning book by Kevin Boyle. It's called The Arc of Justice. And this is a book he wrote about an incident that occurred in 1924, I might be wrong in the date, in Detroit, when an African-American family moved into a white neighborhood. Ocean Sweet was a doctor, and a successful doctor, and he wanted to move his family to a better neighborhood, into a white neighborhood. And so he did. And before too long, his house became a target for whites that didn't want him there. And it culminated when a white racist mob gathered outside, and he and several friends, hunkered down inside. They had guns. The crowd had guns, and one of the members of the crowd got shot and killed.
Goodness.
Yeah, and it could never be. I don't think it was ever proved just where the shot came from, who fired the shot, but he was put on trial for murder. And so the book is a story of this incident. But the way that Kevin writes this book, it's a brilliant example, not as history of fiction, but he writes it like
a fiction,
like a story that you can't put it down, and it gets at many of those themes of U.S. history that I think are important to learn about. Principles of freedom, fairness, equality, and injustice at the same time. And Kevin himself is an incredibly talented historian, but also a very deeply committed and caring person and historian too. And he's personally helped me in some of my research, going out of his way to look up a local history of a figure that I was working on in Ohio, and he's just took his time to do this and sent this to me. So he's a great guy.
Those are the great 3 books. I'll leave those books in the description below. Okay. So what are your habits and micro habits like daily? So what do you do as a constant routine, Paul?
This was another one.
So is it all over the shop?
Heck, I don't know. I mean, Jennifer laughed at this one. Yeah, she says, yeah, you're a creature of habit. Well, I don't know. I mean, I have 2 cups of coffee in the morning. Mm-hmm. Got to have coffee. There's no question.
Yep.
And probably like most of us these days, check the phone, turn on the computer, check the email. That's the case every morning. But then it depends on what time of the year it is and the day of the week. If it's during the teaching semester, it's all defined by my teaching schedule and what I have on that day. And that's about as far as it goes. I can say also, though, when it comes to teaching, an hour before any class, be it a lecture or a tutorial, I need to shut the door and get my head in the zone for the class, because it's getting the lesson straight in my mind. Or if it's a lecture, not memorizing the lecture, but just going over it because I want to be ready to go on in showtime. Mm-hmm. And so it's like being in my green room. So it's a similar sort of routine that I have before playing a game. I have a very definite routine that I adhere to strictly before every hockey game I play. And same thing with lecturing, because you're going on stage. Other than that, I probably have a manner of habits and quirks, but I couldn't draw them to mind. I'd like to say that I was very disciplined in my scholarship, and that I write every day like I told you to do, but I don't practice what I preach. I aspire to, but I'm not successful.
I think you do. I mean, everybody can't really look at Paul's room right now, but it's just full of like hundreds of books in here, so you can tell that he's a definite scholar and and all kinds of intellectual curiosities. So. Good habits, Paul.
Yeah, so...
So, did you have a low point in your life? And if so, how did you overcome it? So, every guest I've had talked about their adversities.
Yeah.
Dr. Brash had faced 2 divorces in his life, and as an individual, he's remarkable. And so, what about you?
Well, I think everybody has low points. I mean,
yes.
Not just one low point, but multiple low points, I'm sure of it. Probably, and most relevant to our interview today, I would say when I was trying to finish my dissertation, I struggled because I took on a large topic, and as perhaps is the case with most PhD students, maybe some are more natural than others, maybe others have really hands-on directing supervisors, and in my case I took on a large topic, and my original supervisor didn't get tenure and left, and a new one took me on, and she was great. Brilliant, fabulous historian, Colleen Dunleavy, but I struggled to bring it together and to write it, and that was a difficult time, as I recall, and in my 20s, and how did I get through it? I, as I probably always do, just bulldozed and stubbornly, and stubbornness is probably one of my character traits, just persisted and got it done. I actually ended up writing it in a relatively short period of time. It wasn't a great dissertation. It needed a serious edit. It was far too long. But I would say that was definitely a low point. But another ongoing low point, I'll just be candid about, probably many academics, and I'm not sure if there's any one character trait or origin that brings us together, feel that they aren't worthy of being in the academy. Is the imposter syndrome. And so I often feel that I'm still not worthy to be a historian at the University of Auckland.
And you question that all the time?
Yeah, actually I do. I mean, is my scholarship good enough? Am I productive enough? Is my teaching good enough? So I'm always questioning myself if I'm really worthy of being here. And this may speak to just who I am, that probably coming from a lower middle class family, single-headed household from the other side of the tracks in a community that tended to be more affluent than we were. I felt I had something to prove, or I needed to prove something, and got a couple of lucky breaks that brought me to a very good university, getting a scholarship for carrying golf bags, and then getting a lucky break in getting this job. So I've been very fortunate in where I've gotten to. But I think it's probably not uncommon with people in the academy who come from either the working class or other backgrounds. They question their worthiness in the academy, and so that might not seem apparent to you looking at me, but it's true. So that's my admission or confession for you.
Great. I think you're an awesome lecturer, and you continue to do so. Never question yourself. Well, question yourself, but don't do it too far, obviously. Do you have particular advice to students like myself who have ambitions to enter academia?
Don't do it. I only half jest, Leonard. The worldwide, the employment prospects in the university sector and academia are slim. And they've been slim for many years. In fact, when I expressed an interest in going to graduate school, both David Roediger and another historian who was important to me as an undergraduate both said, don't do it.
But you did.
Of course, I ignored their advice. So you need to be aware of that really, if you're going to complete a PhD, you need to do so fully understanding that you might not get a job. And it may be easy to say to yourself, yep, I just want to do it for the sake of it, but I can guarantee that when you finish it, you're going to feel you want to get a job. You want to carry on with what you're doing in most instances. And so if you are determined to go on to academia, you need to have a passion for it. You need to have the fire in the belly. You need to be really, really committed, because only that will get you through. Having funding helps, whether it's personal or in terms of grants or scholarships. That's definitely important. But you need to be passionate about it. You need to be totally committed to doing it. It's sort of like entering the priesthood in a way.
I hope a lot of people follow that advice. Well, probably not, maybe. We don't know. What's the best way for students to get in contact with you for advice or anything? Just your email?
Old school. Email is best.
No social media, just blank.
No, and
not really.
The only reason I'm on Facebook, and I'm so wanting to just ditch Facebook after all the revelations about Facebook's and indiscretions and dodgy practices.
Of course.
It's only because I get ice hockey. I'm part of an ice hockey community. No, I try to stay as much off social media as possible. And so email, being old school, easiest way to get in touch with me.
I'll leave that in the description. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome, Leonard. It's been a pleasure.